I am 53, 20-year-old. Boy did this to me, and I will never forget it. When I first met him, I thought he was just a fleeting moment in my life, but what he did to me changed everything. What happens when the spark you thought had faded returns, but from the most unexpected source? And what do you risk when you decide to embrace it? Stay with me as I unravel a story of love, fear, and the choice that redefined everything I thought I knew. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. I'd love to hear from you. The next week passed in a haze of conflicting emotions. Every time I went to the coffee shop, my heart would race at the thought of seeing him, and yet I felt a strange relief when he wasn't there. It was as if I was tiptoeing along the edge of something I couldn't quite define. Dangerous, thrilling, and deeply unsettling. Then, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, he was there. This time, he wasn't just behind the counter or seated at a table. He was waiting near the door, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his jeans, a smile lighting up his face when he saw me. "Hey, Emily," he said, his voice warm and familiar, as though we'd known each other for years. "I was hoping you'd show up today." I stopped in my tracks, the casual confidence in his tone disarming me. "Is that so?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, stepping closer. "Yeah, I was thinking, maybe you'd like to grab a coffee with me, somewhere else, somewhere quieter." The words hung between us, heavy with implication. I hesitated, every rational part of my mind screaming at me to say no. But then he smiled, that same disarming smile that made my stomach flip, and I found myself nodding before I could stop myself. "Sure," I said, the word slipping out as though it belonged to someone else. We ended up at a small cafe, tucked away in a part of town I rarely visited. It was quiet, intimate, the kind of place that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of time. He chose a corner table near the window, and as we sat down, I couldn't help but notice how close the chairs were, how little space there was between us. "Why here?" I asked, gesturing to the quaint surroundings. He shrugged, leaning back in his chair. It felt right. Quiet enough to talk, but not so quiet it's awkward." I laughed, shaking my head. "You have an interesting way of looking at things." He tilted his head, his dark eyes studying me. "And you have a way of making me want to look closer?" The compliment caught me off guard, and I felt a warmth creep into my cheeks. "You're full of charm, aren't you?" I said, trying to deflect the sudden intimacy of his words. "Only when it's deserved," he replied, his voice soft but steady. There it was again, that disarming sincerity that made it impossible to look away. I searched for something to say, anything to break the tension, but he spoke first. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his tone suddenly serious. I nodded, bracing myself. "Of course. Why do you come to the coffee shop every Thursday? You're always there, sitting in the same spot, lost in your thoughts. What are you looking for?" The question took me by surprise, and for a moment I didn't know how to answer. What was I looking for? An escape, perhaps? A moment of quiet in a life that often felt too loud, too overwhelming. But his question went deeper than that, as if he already knew the answer and was waiting for me to admit it. "I guess I'm looking for peace," I said finally. "A break from everything." He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. "I get that. But what if peace isn't what you need? What if it's something else?" I frowned, unsure of what he meant. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "What if what you really need is to feel alive again. His words stayed with me long after our coffee date ended. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen something in me I'd spent years trying to hide. He was right, of course. My life had become predictable, safe, and, in the process, I'd lost a part of myself I didn't even realize was missing. The next time I saw him, it was deliberate. I went to the coffee shop on a Friday, a day I usually avoided, knowing he'd be working. He looked up as I walked in, his face lighting up with a smile that sent my heart racing. "Emily," he said, coming around the counter to meet me. "This is a surprise." "I thought I'd mix things up," I replied, my voice more confident than I felt. He grinned, his eyes sparkling with amusement. "Mixing things up, huh? I like it." We talked for hours that day, sitting at a table in the corner while the world outside blurred into irrelevance. He told me about his plans for the future, his dreams and his fears. And for the first time in years, I found myself opening up to someone in a way I hadn't since I was much younger. There was something about him that made it easy to talk, to share the parts of myself I usually kept hidden. He didn't judge, didn't offer platitudes or unsolicited advice. He just listened, his dark eyes filled with a warmth and understanding that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in decades. As the sun began to set, he leaned across the table, his voice soft and steady. "You know, Emily, I think you're incredible. You have this way of carrying the world on your shoulders and still managing to look graceful while doing it. But you don't have to carry it all alone. You need your crew first." The words hit me like a wave, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I looked away, unable to hold his gaze, but he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. "It's okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. My heart was pounding, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't untangle. All I knew was that in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Alive, seen, and impossibly drawn to the young man sitting across from me. That night, as I walked home, the air felt electric, charged with a possibility I didn't yet understand. I knew what was happening was risky, even dangerous, but I couldn't bring myself to stop it. There was something about him, something undeniable, and for the first time in years, I didn't want to play it safe. I laughed. "And what makes you think I'd be interested in abstract art?" He shrugged, a mischievous grin tugging at his lips. "Because you're not as predictable as you think you are." His words stayed with me as I dressed that evening, choosing a deep green dress that had hung in the back of my closet for far too long. When I arrived, he was waiting outside, his usual casual demeanor replaced with a quiet intensity that made my breath catch. "You look beautiful," he said simply, his gaze lingering on me for just a moment too long. I smiled, feeling a warmth rise to my cheeks. "You clean up nicely yourself." The gallery was small but vibrant, the walls adorned with pieces that seemed to pulse with emotion. We wandered through the exhibits together, his insights surprisingly thoughtful for someone his age. He spoke about the art with a passion that was almost infectious, drawing me into his world with every word. At one point, we stopped in front of a piece that seemed to explode with chaotic energy, streaks of red and gold clashing against a stormy backdrop. He studied it for a moment before turning to me. "It's like life, isn't it?" he said softly. "Messy, unpredictable, but somehow beautiful." "SMG," I nodded, my gaze fixed on the painting. I suppose it is. He stepped closer, the space between us shrinking to something almost unbearable. You're beautiful too, Emily. Do you know that? My breath hitched, and I turned to face him, his dark eyes locking onto mine. There was no mistaking the intent in his gaze, the raw honesty that left me feeling both exposed and understood. You don't mean that, I whispered, my voice trembling. I do, he said firmly, his hand brushing against mine. I've meant it from the moment I met you. The air around us seemed to thicken, the noise of the gallery fading into a distant hum. I knew I should step back, create some distance, remind both of us of the impossibility of what was happening. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, caught in the pull of something I didn't fully understand. The moment passed, but the memory of it lingered, haunting me in the quiet hours of the night. I replayed his words over and over, wondering how someone so young could see so deeply into the parts of me I tried so hard to hide. The next time we met, it wasn't by chance. He called me, something he'd never done before, and asked if I'd join him for dinner. Just the two of us, he said, his voice low and steady. No coffee shop, no art gallery. I want to spend time with you. I hesitated, the weight of his request settling over me. This wasn't a casual encounter. It was something more, something I wasn't sure I was ready for. But, as always, his sincerity disarmed me, and before I knew it, I was agreeing. We met at a small, intimate restaurant tucked away in a quiet part of town. The lighting was soft, the atmosphere warm and inviting. He had chosen the table carefully, away from the main dining area where the shadows offered a semblance of privacy. As we talked, the conversation flowed effortlessly, touching on everything from his childhood dreams to my long-forgotten passions. He listened intently, his gaze never wavering, as though every word I said held significance. At one point, he reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. Emily, he said softly, his voice tinged with vulnerability. I don't think I've ever met anyone like you. I looked away, the intensity of his words too much to bear. You don't know me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But I want to, he replied, his hand closing over mine. Every part of you. The words hung between us, heavy with meaning. I knew what he was saying, what he was offering, and I knew the risks, the impossibilities, the inevitable fallout. But in that moment, none of it mattered. All I could think about was the way his touch felt, the way his words made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. When we left the restaurant, the air was cool and crisp, a faint breeze carrying the scent of rain. He walked me to my car, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back. We stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between us, charged with unspoken words. Thank you for tonight, I said finally, my voice trembling. He smiled, his hand brushing a stray hair from my face. The pleasure was mine. And then, before I could think, before I could second guess, he leaned in. His lips met mine in a kiss that was soft, tentative, yet filled with a quiet intensity that stole my breath. For a moment, the world disappeared. There were no consequences, no doubts, no fears, just the two of us, caught in a moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. When we pulled apart, his eyes searched mine, as if seeking reassurance. Emily, he began, but I silenced him with a finger to his lips. Don't, I whispered, my voice breaking. Just don't. He nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. We stood there for a moment longer before I turned and got into my car, my heart pounding as I drove away. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His words, his touch, the way he made me feel. I knew I was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could shatter everything I'd built. But for the first time in years, I felt alive. The kiss lingered with me, haunting every quiet moment and invading every thought. I told myself I'd put a stop to it, that it was a mistake born of vulnerability and a longing for something I couldn't even name. But the next day, when my phone buzzed with a message from him, my resolve crumbled. It was simple, just his name and a single question. Can I see you tonight? I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, my heart battling my head. I typed out a refusal 3 times and deleted it each time before finally sending a single word in reply. Yes. We met at his apartment, a modest studio on the edge of the city. It was clean and uncluttered, with bookshelves lining one wall and a small balcony overlooking the street below. He greeted me at the door, his smile warm but tinged with uncertainty, as though he was just as unsure of what came next as I was. "Emily," he said, his voice soft as he stepped aside to let me in. "I wasn't sure you'd come. Feeling it myself?" "Neither was I admitted, my words heavy with the truth of my indecision. He closed the door behind me, and for a moment, we just stood there, the air between us thick with unspoken words. Then he reached out, his hand brushing mine, and the tension broke. "Can I take your coat?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with something deeper. I nodded, letting him slip it from my shoulders and hang it on a nearby hook. He gestured toward the small couch in the corner, and we sat down, the space between us feeling both vast and non-existent. "I made us something to eat," he said, motioning toward a table set with simple plates and glasses of wine. "It's nothing fancy, just pasta and salad, but I thought—" "It's perfect," I interrupted, my voice trembling slightly. "Thank you." We ate in companionable silence, the clinking of forks against plates the only sound. Occasionally, our eyes would meet across the table, and each time, my heart raced as though I were a teenager again. I could feel the pull between us, growing stronger with every passing moment. After dinner, we moved back to the couch, the wine loosening our words and making the conversation flow easily. He asked me about my life, my dreams, my regrets, the parts of myself I rarely shared with anyone, and I found myself opening up, telling him things I hadn't admitted even to myself. "I used to paint," I said at one point, surprising even myself with the confession. His eyes lit up with curiosity. "Really? What kind of things did you paint?" "Landscapes, mostly," I replied, smiling wistfully. "It's been years, though. Life got in the way. When you return, I am glad to see you back," he wrote. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You should pick it up again. You shouldn't let life stop you from doing what you love." His words struck a chord, and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "It's not that simple." "Maybe it is," he said softly, his hand reaching out to rest on mine. "Maybe you just need someone to remind you how to start." As the evening wore on, the space between us disappeared entirely. At some point, I found myself leaning into him, his arm draped around my shoulders, the warmth of his body seeping into mine. It felt natural, as though we'd been like this forever, and yet every nerve in my body was on high alert. When he turned to face me, his hand gently brushing a strand of hair from my face, I knew what was coming, and this time I didn't try to stop it. His lips met mine in a kiss that was deeper, more urgent than before, and I felt myself giving in to the pull I'd fought so hard to resist. "Emily," he murmured against my lips, his voice filled with a mix of need and uncertainty. "Are you sure?" "Ah, yeah." I pulled back slightly, my eyes meeting his. "No," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want to stop." That was all the encouragement he needed. He kissed me again, his hands cradling my face as though I were something precious. It was slow, deliberate, each movement filled with a tenderness that took my breath away. He led me to the bed, his touch never wavering. And for the first time in years, I let myself go. The next morning, I woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains, his arm draped lazily over my waist. For a moment, I allowed myself to savor the warmth of his body, the steady rise and fall of his chest against my back. But reality crept in, bringing with it a wave of guilt and doubt. What had I done? What had I allowed to happen? I carefully slipped out of bed, trying not to wake him, and gathered my clothes from the floor. As I dressed, my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one more chaotic than the last. I couldn't stay. I couldn't face the questions, the judgment, not from him, and certainly not from myself. I left a note on the kitchen counter, simple and to the point. "Thank you for last night. I need time to think." For days I avoided him, ignoring his calls and texts, burying myself in work and routine in a desperate attempt to regain control. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His touch, his words, the way he made me feel like the most alive version of myself. And in time, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His touch, his words, the way he made me feel like the most alive version of myself. Finally, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, I found myself back at the coffee shop. He was there, of course, standing behind the counter, his face lighting up with a mixture of relief and longing when he saw me. "Emily," he said, coming around the counter to meet me. I was starting to think I'd never see you again. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "I didn't know how to face you after." He reached out, his hand gently brushing mine. "You don't have to apologize. I needed to know if you were okay." I nodded, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "I am. But us, it's complicated." He smiled, a bittersweet expression that made my heart ache. Complicated doesn't mean impossible. I looked away, the weight of his words settling over me. Maybe not, but it doesn't mean it's right either. We stood there in silence, the rain tapping against the windows as the world outside blurred into a wash of gray. And in that moment, I realized that no matter how much I wanted him, no matter how alive he made me feel, the path forward was anything but clear. The days that followed were a storm of emotions, each one crashing into the next, leaving me reeling. I couldn't stop thinking about him, the way he looked at me, the warmth of his touch, the way his presence made everything else in my life feel pale in comparison. And yet, the weight of what we had done bore down on me, relentless and unforgiving. I tried to lose myself in routine, throwing myself into work, reconnecting with old friends, and even dabbling in painting again. But none of it filled the void he had left behind. Every brushstroke, every conversation, every quiet moment alone was haunted by his voice, his laugh, the way he made me feel seen in a way no one else had in years. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. One evening, I found myself standing outside his apartment, my heart pounding as I debated whether to knock. Before I could decide, the door opened and there he was, his expression shifting from surprise to something softer, warmer. "Emily," he said, his voice laced with relief. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see you again." I looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I shouldn't be here," I said, my voice trembling. But I couldn't stay away. He stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. "You're always welcome here." We sat on the couch, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. He didn't press me for answers, didn't demand an explanation. He just waited, his patience somehow more disarming than any words could have been. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to feel about any of this." He reached out, his hand brushing mine in a gesture that was both comforting and electrifying. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight," he said softly. "But whatever you're feeling, you don't have to face it alone." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to my eyes, and before I knew it, they were spilling over, hot and unrelenting. He pulled me into his arms, holding me as I cried, his presence grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. When the tears finally subsided, I pulled back, my gaze meeting his. "I'm scared," I admitted, "of what this means, of what people will think, of how this could change everything." His expression was tender, his voice steady as he replied, "I'm scared too, but I know what I feel for you is real, and I think that's worth facing the fear." That night marked a turning point for us. We began to see each other more frequently, though always in secret. Our relationship existed in a bubble, a world apart from the realities of my life. In those stolen moments, it was easy to forget the risks, the consequences, the impossibility of what we were doing. But the bubble couldn't last forever. One evening, as we sat on his balcony watching the city lights flicker below, he turned to me, his expression serious. "Emily," he said, his voice hesitant, "I don't want to hide anymore." His words hit me like a blow, and I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. "What are you saying?" He took my hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I'm saying I want us to be real, to be something more than stolen moments and hidden glances. I want to share my life with you, not just in secret, but in the open." I pulled my hand away, standing up and turning my back to him as I tried to steady my breathing. "You don't understand," I said, my voice trembling. "If people knew about us, my friends, my family, my colleagues, it would ruin everything." He stood as well, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "Maybe it would, but isn't what we have worth the risk?" I turned to face him, my emotions warring within me. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know if I'm brave enough to find out." The pain in his eyes was unmistakable, but he nodded, his voice soft as he replied, "I understand. But you need to know something, Emily. I'm in this, fully, completely. I'm not afraid of what people will think or what it might cost me. Because you're worth it." His words stayed with me long after I left that night, echoing in my mind as I tried to make sense of the tangled mess of emotions that had taken root in my heart. I wanted to believe him, to believe that what we had was worth the risk. But the fear was always there, lurking in the background, whispering all the reasons why it could never work. The breaking point came on a Saturday afternoon when I ran into an old friend at the grocery store. She was the type of woman who always seemed to know everyone's business, and as we chatted, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was sizing me up, searching for cracks in my carefully constructed facade. "So," she said, her tone casual but her eyes sharp, "I hear you've been spending a lot of time at that little coffee shop downtown. Met anyone interesting?" My heart skipped a beat and I forced a smile, pretending not to understand the implication. "Oh, just enjoying some quiet time with a good book," I said lightly. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Well, if you ever need company, let me know. I'd hate for people to get the wrong idea." The encounter left me shaken, and I couldn't help but wonder how much she knew or suspected. The thought of our secret being exposed, of my carefully curated life unraveling, was almost too much to bear. That evening, I went to his apartment, my heart heavy with the weight of what I knew I had to do. When he opened the door, his face lit up with a smile that quickly faded when he saw my expression. "Emily," he said, his voice filled with concern. "What's wrong?" I stepped inside, my hands trembling as I tried to find the words. "I can't do this anymore," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I can't keep living in fear of what people will think, of what this could cost me." His face fell, and he reached for my hand, his voice pleading. "Don't do this, Emily. Don't let fear win." Tears streamed down my face as I pulled away. "I'm sorry," I whispered, "but I have to let you go." As I walked away, my heart felt like it was breaking into a million pieces. I knew I was leaving behind something extraordinary, something that had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. But the fear, the weight of what we were risking was too much. I had no idea if I'd made the right choice, or if I ever would. "I am 53. 20-year-old boy did this to me, and I will never forget it." The days after I ended things with him felt hollow. It was supposed to get easier. Everyone always says that. But with every passing day, the ache grew deeper, more unbearable. I threw myself into distractions, work, painting, even reconnecting with old friends, but none of it filled the void. Then, one evening, I found myself at the park where we'd first shared that long walk together. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the trees, and for a moment, I allowed myself to remember the sound of his laughter, the way he challenged me to see the world differently. It all came rushing back with such clarity that it left me breathless. Here, I sat on a bench, watching as families played and couples strolled hand in hand, and I wondered if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Was I really protecting myself? Or was I just running away from something that scared me? As the sun dipped below the horizon, I pulled out my phone, my fingers hovering over his number. I didn't even know what I wanted to say. An apology, an explanation, a desperate plea to go back to the way things were. But before I could decide, the phone buzzed in my hand. It was him. My heart leapt into my throat as I stared at the screen, his name glowing against the darkness. For a moment, I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the answer button. Then, with a deep breath, I pressed it. "Emily," he said, his voice soft but filled with something I couldn't quite place. Relief, maybe, or hope. "I didn't think you'd answer." I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. "I wasn't sure I should." There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his words were measured, careful. I know why you did what you did, and I understand. But I can't let you walk away thinking you're alone in this. Because you're not. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I looked away, trying to steady my breathing. I don't know if I can do this, I admitted. The fear, the judgment, it's overwhelming. I know, he said gently, but I don't care about any of that. I care about you, and I am willing to face whatever comes, as long as it means being with you. His words hit me like a tidal wave, washing over the walls I'd so carefully built around myself. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to imagine what it would be like to stop running, to let myself feel without fear. Can we meet? I asked, my voice trembling. We met at the park the next evening, under the same tree where we'd once stopped to watch the ducks on the pond. He was already there when I arrived, his hands in his pockets as he paced back and forth. When he saw me, he froze, his eyes searching mine for something I couldn't quite name. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said, his voice filled with equal parts relief and hesitation. I took a step closer, my heart pounding. Neither was I. We stood there for a moment, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. Then he reached out, his hand brushing mine in a gesture that was both familiar and electrifying. "I've missed you," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I've missed you too," I admitted, the words breaking something inside me, more than I thought possible. His hand closed over mine, his grip steady and grounding. "Then let's stop pretending we can do this alone. I don't want to hide anymore, Emily, but I'll follow your lead, whatever you decide." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet strength of his resolve, was my undoing. I stepped closer, closing the space between us, and looked up at him, my eyes searching his. "I'm scared," I admitted, "but I don't want to lose you." "You won't," he promised, his voice steady. "We'll figure it out together." The weeks that followed were both exhilarating and terrifying. We didn't shout our relationship from the rooftops, but we didn't hide it either. Slowly, I began introducing him to the parts of my life I'd kept separate. The art gallery where I'd started painting again, the small circle of friends I trusted with my deepest secrets. Not everyone understood. Some whispered behind our backs, their judgments evident in the way they avoided eye contact or spoke in hushed tones when we entered a room. But for every sideways glance, there was also a moment of acceptance. A friend who offered a genuine smile. A stranger who treated us no differently than anyone else. One evening, as we sat on his balcony watching the city lights, he turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice filled with a quiet vulnerability. I shook my head, my heart swelling with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. "No," I said softly, "not for a second." He smiled, his hand finding mine. "Neither do I." Ugh. As the months turned into years, our relationship became a part of my life, not a secret I had to protect. We faced challenges, of course, moments of doubt, of fear, of wondering if the world would ever fully accept us. But through it all, we held on to each other, finding strength in the bond we'd built. Looking back now, I realize how close I came to walking away from something extraordinary. It wasn't easy, and there were times when the weight of it all felt unbearable. But every time I looked into his eyes, I knew it was worth it. because in him I found not just love, but a reminder of who I was, who I could be, if only I let myself try. It's been years since that first kiss under the soft glow of his apartment's balcony light. When I think about it now, it feels like a lifetime ago. Another version of myself who stood on the precipice of something terrifyingly unknown. And yet, here I am, on the other side of that fear, living a life I never imagined was possible. Our journey wasn't without its struggles. There were whispers, of course. Friends who called less often, colleagues who avoided eye contact, and even family members who expressed their disapproval in subtle but pointed ways. At first, it hurt more than I wanted to admit. I'd spent so much of my life trying to fit into the neat little box society had constructed for me, and now here I was, unapologetically stepping out of it. But for every sideways glance, there was also a moment of joy. There were days spent laughing until my stomach hurt, nights where his arms felt like the safest place in the world, and quiet mornings where the sunlight streaming through the curtains seemed to hold the promise of something new. Those moments were my anchor, the reason I kept moving forward even when the world felt heavy. "You're serious about this guy?" Daniel had asked, his tone sharp with disbelief. "Mom, he's closer to my age than yours." Lauren was quieter, her expression unreadable as she sipped her coffee and avoided my gaze. "I just don't want you to get hurt," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "Are you sure about him?" I understood their concerns. They were valid after all. But as I sat across from them, trying to explain something that felt impossible to put into words, I realized it wasn't their approval I needed. I loved them deeply, and I wanted their support, but this was my life, my happiness. And for the first time in years, I wasn't willing to compromise that. "He makes me happy," I said simply, my voice steady. "And that's all I need you to understand." It wasn't immediate, but over time they began to see what I saw in him. They saw the way he looked at me, the way he cared for me, the way he brought a lightness to my life that had been missing for far too long. Slowly, their skepticism softened into something resembling acceptance, and eventually, love. He smiled, his hand resting lightly on my waist. "No," he said softly, "you did this. I just reminded you what you were capable of." The years passed, and our lives became a tapestry of shared moments, some beautiful, some messy, but all ours. We traveled, exploring places I'd only dreamed of visiting. We celebrated milestones and weathered challenges, learning and growing together in ways I hadn't thought possible. Of course, the whispers never fully disappeared. There were always people who couldn't understand our relationship, who saw only the numbers on our birth certificates and not the connection we shared. But over time, I stopped caring. Their opinions were just noise, a distant hum in the background of a life that felt full and meaningful. One day, as we sat together on the porch of a small cottage we'd rented for the weekend, he turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. I looked at him, my heart swelling with a love that had only deepened over the years. "Not for a second," I said honestly. "You've given me more than I ever thought I deserved." He smiled, reaching for my hand. "You deserve everything, Emily, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving that to you." Now, as I sit in my studio, surrounded by canvases and the faint scent of turpentine, I think about how far we've come. My life isn't perfect. Whose is? But it's real, and it's mine, and it's more than I ever dared to hope for. He still challenges me, still pushes me to see the world through a lens I'd long since abandoned, and in return, I remind him of the quiet beauty in life's simpler moments, the ones that too often go unnoticed. Looking back, I realize how close I came to letting fear dictate my choices, how easy it would have been to walk away, to bury my feelings and retreat into the safety of routine. But the truth is, nothing worth having ever comes without risk. Loving him wasn't the safe choice. It wasn't the easy choice. But it was the right one. And for that, I will be forever grateful. As the sun sets outside my window, casting the room in a warm golden glow, I find myself smiling. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Life is too short to live in fear of what others might think. Sometimes the greatest joys come from the moments we least expect, from taking a chance, from stepping into the unknown, and from allowing ourselves to be truly, unapologetically alive.